Hello and welcome to another session of Revision on American West. Today what we're going to look at is why there was conflict between the US settlers and the native Indians. To start with, there wasn't really very much conflict, partly because in 1832 it was agreed that there would be a permanent frontier, which frontier is like a kind of a point at which people wouldn't go beyond. It was the furthest point that they'd travelled to. So the US settlers agreed that they wouldn't go beyond a certain eastern point in America, and that it would permanently always belong to the Indians, the native Indians, that land beyond that eastern point in America. So in 1832 there was no reason for conflict. In the 1840s there was very little conflict as well. Largely the Native Americans, the US settlers and the native Indians traded very peacefully. And it's only towards the end of the 1840s, in 1848 and 1849, when gold is discovered in California and the gold rush begins, that there starts to become reason for conflict on the plains. And that's because there's a much larger number of US settlers rushing across the Great Plains, which is the area which the native Indians were hunting and being nomadic around. And also because the people who were going across to the gold rush also brought along diseases such as cholera and smallpox. Smallpox in particular wiped out a large portion of the native Indian population around the area where gold had been found in the west of America. And for that reason there became suspicion. Native Indians were suspicious of the US settlers, and there was some reason for conflict in those areas. Additionally, peace treaties were made over the period of the 1850s and 60s. In particular, in 1851 and 1868, there were peace treaties signed at Fort Laramie. And although this, on the face of it, doesn't look like a reason for conflict between the US settlers and native Indians, the reason these peace treaties did lead to conflict is that almost immediately after being signed, the treaties were broken, usually by the US settlers rather than the native Indians. And therefore it became difficult for the native Indians to trust that the peace treaties would actually be maintained. One of the first major conflicts happened in 1862, and it's known as Little Crow's War, Little Crow being the chief of the native Indians who were involved in this war. The cause of Little Crow's War was the fact that Little Crow's people had been forced to live on a reservation. So rather than living freely a nomadic life on the Great Plains, they'd been asked to live in a certain area of the plains, which became known as a reservation. And the area of land which they'd been asked to move to was really infertile, so crops wouldn't grow very easily, and it was difficult for them to continue to hunt because there weren't very many buffalo at all. And although they'd been promised when they moved to this reservation that if there were no crops or if they had difficulty hunting buffalo, the US settlers would offer them support and extra food, they were given no compensation whatsoever. So there's no food, there's no buffalo to hunt, 12,000 people might starve, and the US settlers are offering no support whatsoever, which makes Little Crow and the native Indians very angry indeed. So this leads to the event of Little Crow's War. In 1862, there was an attack on the white settlers by the Native Americans, and 20 white settlers and 20 male white settlers and 10 women and children were killed by the Native Americans. Food was taken from buildings, and the buildings were burnt to the ground. And the event lasted for about 3 months before the army actually managed to regain control from the Native Americans. What was the outcome of Little Crow's War? Well, 38 Indians were hung as a result of the war as a punishment for the events, and the rest of Little Crow's tribe were moved to a smaller reservation than they'd been living on before. So it didn't really overcome the cause of the problem. It didn't stop there being the likelihood of another outbreak of rebellion like Little Crow's people had rebelled. It just suppressed this particular group of Indians and stopped them from attacking any white settlers again. However, this was not the only conflict between the US settlers and the native Indians. In fact, another very famous conflict between US settlers and native Indians was the Cheyenne Uprising, also known as the Sand Creek Massacre, which occurred in 1864. The reason for this conflict was that a treaty which had been made between the native Indians and the US settlers meant that the Cheyenne Nation, native Indians, had been left on very dry, infertile land, and they were also facing starvation, very similar to the fact that Little Crow's people, the reason for them rising up in rebellion had been lack of food. And what the Cheyenne started doing to try and overcome this problem was they started attacking wagon trains for food. They didn't harm any of the travellers, but they were attacking the wagon trains. And by 1864, the army began to suspect that they were also cattle rustling, so stealing cattle from cattlemen. And this was a hangable offence. So the event. What was the conflict? Well, the army invaded a Cheyenne village to punish them for cattle rustling or suspected cattle rustling, and their chief, Black Kettle, he went out and he was waving a white flag to show that they were peaceful and that they weren't going to fight. However, the army continued their invasion and at Sand Creek settlement, which is where Black Kettle was, and they killed 163 Cheyenne people, including 110 children. And not only did they kill them, they also scalped them, which, if you remember from looking at the religious beliefs of the native Indians, was incredibly serious, as they believed that if they took the scalp off a person, it meant they wouldn't be able to go to the afterlife. So what was the outcome of this tragic event? Well, when the east of America heard about this, they were absolutely horrified, and the colonel who was in charge, Colonel Shivington, was made to leave the army. But this wasn't the only thing. So although the east of the US was horrified by the event, so obviously were other Indian nations. So the Indian nations of the Cheyenne, the Sioux, Comanche, and various other ones as well, all joined forces to attack white settlements. So between 1864 and 1868, they were attacking white settlements, and they did fairly well in their attacks, partly because not only were they excellent horse riders, but they also by this point had many guns, which they'd been getting from trade with white settlers. In 1867, all Indian nations except for Red Cloud and his nation had signed a peace treaty at Medicine Lodge Creek, but this wasn't the end of the conflict between Red Cloud and the US settlers, and we're about to look at Red Cloud's War, which continues in 1867. So what caused Red Cloud's War, which was a Sioux conflict in 1867 with the US settlers? The main cause was actually a broken treaty. So unlike the previous two conflicts which we've looked at, which have been mainly caused by lack of food on the reservations they've been forced to live on, this was a broken treaty. So at the Fort Laramie Treaty, they'd agreed that certain area would be just for the Indians to live and hunt on, and unfortunately gold had been found in Montana in the Rockies, and this was one of the areas the Sioux had been given as their reservation, their land. So there started to become people travelling across this land on what became known as the Bozeman Trail, people looking for gold. And not only were people following a trail in the Indian hunting ground, but also they started to build forts on this land in order to make sure that they were protected from any attack from the native Indians. So the Sioux start attacking the gold seekers as they're really angry about the fact that the gold seekers are on their hunting ground and they're disrupting their hunting. Red Cloud, who was the chief of the Sioux Nation in this area of the Montana in the Rockies, ordered attacks on soldiers and anyone also involved in building the forts for the soldiers on the Bozeman Trail, as this was their hunting ground. And one captain of the army, Captain Fetterman, happened to be in the area when Red Cloud and his men attacked them, and the people who were taking trees and logs to build some forts. And the Red Cloud and the Sioux Nation, they killed around 100 people in his army. And not only did they kill the men, but they burnt all the forts down to the ground that were being built on the Bozeman Trail. So what was the outcome of this? Well, first of all, obviously humiliation for the US Army. Captain Fetterman and his army had been well and truly defeated, but this meant that they wanted revenge, but also a treaty had to be signed. So the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was created, and it agreed that there was a Great Sioux Reservation and no white settlers would be allowed in that area. So on the face of it, Red Cloud's War was quite a success for the Native Indians, unlike the previous two conflicts, which had led to most of the Native Indians kind of giving in to the US settlers. In this case, there'd been an agreement that the Native Indians, particularly the Sioux Nation, would be given an area of land where no white settlers were allowed. There was a slight problem with this, which is that it was on the condition that they were not leaving that reservation. And not all Native Indians agreed with the Sioux, and there were some younger Native Indian chiefs, for example, Sitting Bull, who wouldn't stay within the Great Reservation and would want to go outside of it, which would lead to further conflicts. This was as the Native Indian nations were quite independent of each other. Another famous example of a conflict between US settlers and Native Indians was the Battle of Washita, which happened in 1868. The main cause of the battle was that the US Army was first of all feeling pretty humiliated after Red Cloud's War, but also largely because the US Army and the US settlers were worried about Cheyenne attacks on settlers. They'd started to attack settlers who were living in areas which they considered to be theirs. So the event, what happened at the battle? Well, it was actually an attack on Black Kettle's people, so the same people that we'd seen in the early Cheyenne conflicts. And it happened during winter, which is significant because the US Army had realised that the Native Indians didn't really participate in war during winter time, so they knew that they wouldn't be prepared for war. And it also happened at night, so most people were asleep and there wasn't really enough warning for them to build up an army. Not only was it happening at winter where they knew they wouldn't be prepared and at night, but again, Black Kettle's Cheyenne people were peaceful and they wanted peace between them and the US settlers, and they flew a white flag, but this was ignored by the US Army. So they attacked the Cheyenne. What was the outcome of this? Well, there were lots of people who were killed in Black Kettle's Cheyenne Nation. Most of the dead were actually women and children. Similarly to the Sand Creek Massacre, and the resistance of the Indian nations appeared to be over, and they were forced to return to reservations. So any Indians who had been outside of the reservations, maybe for hunting purposes, or just because they felt that they wanted to move around because they were nomads, were no longer able to do that, and they had to move themselves back onto reservations. So this was a real failure for the Native Indians, and it sort of overshadowed Red Cloud's success earlier that year. So why was there conflict between the US settlers and the Native Indians? Well, the answer has to be a mixture of these three things. Broken treaties, agreements that people would be not covering certain areas of land and breaking it because of gold and kind of extra trade reasons. Desperation, particularly in the Little Crow's War and the case of the Sand Creek Massacre. People were stealing food or pushing for extra support because they were starving on the reservations they'd been asked to live on, but also revenge, or arguably the US settlers may have said safety. After Red Cloud's War, it was wanted by the army that the Native Indians return to reservations, either for revenge purposes or for safety purposes for their people, hence them building forts, causing Red Cloud's War, and in the Battle of Washita, where they forced the Native Indians back onto their land. Have a go at this exam style question to use your knowledge that you've gained from this revision video. Explain why there was conflict between the US settlers and the Native Indians. 7 marks. 7 marks, 3 explained reasons. Good luck in your exam.